Hi everyone, Morgan here. So today I want to talk about not just how long your food storage is going to last or what are you going to do when your food storage goes away, but plan now for that long-term preparedness. So I have a layered system. A lot of preppers do, I'm not the only one, okay? A lot of preppers talk about their layers, but I really wanted to talk about this because I think it's super important for us to not just think about our everyday and short-term layers. And I'm going to talk about, those specifically here in just a second, but with inflation the way it is, honestly, I think that, thinking more long-term is seriously important at this point. It's not even end of the world or apocalypse thinking at this point. It's, boy, inflation is getting wild and I'm not even sure I can afford, some of this stuff the way it is, right? So we have to think more long-term, continue to stock up, get what you can from the grocery stores, these kinds of things, bulk buy, do whatever you can. But really, we're going to have to be looking to those local sources, hunting and fishing and growing our own garden and looking to our local community for the things that we may not even be able to get at a certain point. It just kind of depends. Most recently, avocados are now completely banned from, the U.S. has banned importation of avocados from Mexico. And you may not think this is a big deal, but it was one instance of a threat on an inspector's voicemail. And whoever listened to it, the powers that be listened to it and said, you know what, I'm not dealing with this. We're going to cut off all importation of avocados because of this one threat. That's huge. That is the powers that be are now, it's a huge supply issue. While avocados do come from a variety of other sources, a lot of avocados come from Mexico. So that's a really big deal. Think about that though. That could happen for anybody. Not only are we having supply chain issues because, of cargo ships, of COVID or whatever, all these different reasons that we're having supply chain issues. And it's just one thing after another. So we really have to be a little more focused on not just our food stores, but more long-term layers as well. So the first layer that I want to talk about is your everyday. So your everyday layer is going to be things like, that you have in your cabinets that you eat every day, right? Let's say that I actually have a bucket of sugar that I use every day and I have it in my kitchen and that's just a bucket of sugar that I just take from, right? I also have canned soups and I have canned items and I have, cornstarch and baking supplies and I have all these things that I can use every day. My freezer would also be considered an everyday thing, as well as a short term, I would say. So your freezer could also be short term. So short term is going to be things like your freezer could be short term. Things in your freezer could last anywhere from 1 to 3 years, depending on what the product is, right? But then short term is going to be more things like maybe dehydrated things. Your short term will be things like that bucket of sugar that I talked about. While that is every day, it's also short term. It's also long term, and I'll get to that in a second. But that's your short term layer, okay? Another short term that I would actually put in there is going to be a garden. And I say that just because a garden isn't, while you can sustain a garden long term, depending on where you are, or if you have a greenhouse or something like that, that's going to be, I would put that in my short term, as well as I would also put it in my long term, because it's a long-term plan. You know what I mean? It's a long-term plan as well as a short-term plan. It could also be an everyday plan. So your garden is very versatile here, right? But I want to kind of show you. So your garden could be for everyday eating, right? So you have your garden, it's producing, it's going really well, and you eat it for your everyday needs. You also have your garden for your short-term needs. Maybe you have a root cellar that you put it down there, right? And your root cellar is going to get you through from one season to the next season. Like if you live in a cold climate, you would have your root cellar to have all the stuff from the produce that you had in your garden. You take that down to the root cellar and you use it from winter to the next spring. Okay, so that would be a short-term layer. I'm actually going to put root cellar. That's a C. Okay, so root cellar is part of your short-term layer. A root cellar I would not necessarily think of as a long-term layer, but it kind of could be because it's part of preserving as well. But a lot of preserving things that we do, like when we can our own food, can be debated of long-term and short-term canned. It just kind of depends on what you can, how it's canned, what the food is. Some things will not last as long in canned food forms, but best by dates and expiration dates and all those we all know are not, are not always accurate. So like if a canned food says, it's only good for a year, it could be good for 2 or 3 years, depending on the type of food. So let's go into our long term. What is long term? Our long term is going to be things that we put in like Mylar bags, and then we put in a bin, and then we store away. Things like that would be like oats, honey, wheat berries. It's going to be things like salt, sugar, things like that. And those could be in our long term. It could also be in buckets, not just in Mylar bags, but the long term could be in buckets as well, put away. And then, like shorter term, instead of wheat berries, you would have the ground flour, right? So your long term is going to have the wheat berries, and then you grind the wheat berries, but your short term will have the ground flour that you take from. But it could also have that salt and the sugar and things like that you take for short term and long term. So there's definitely a lot of variation here. But what I really want you to pay attention to is going to be really your short and everyday layer. And I say this because as you're taking from this stuff, eventually, let's say you can't afford things, or like it is an SHTF, or inflation is just too high, and you're eating from your everyday and your short term, and then eventually you'll get to your long term layer. This could be because you need to replace your flour or sugar or whatever, so you're taking from your long term in order to replace another layer. So before you even get to the point of taking from your long term, you need to start thinking of your alternative options so that you are not just depleting your entire system, but you are bringing in more things, right? So let's say your options for longer term are going to be the garden. You could also do greenhouse, right? So I was talking about the avocados, and a lot of people were like, I wish I could grow avocados here. And I said, greenhouse, and so a greenhouse can be a really good option, especially if you have ways to heat that greenhouse to keep those tropical fruits or plants or whatever alive. So like if you want to have your own chocolate tree. I call it the chocolate tree. It's like cacao or whatever. But if you want to grow your own chocolate, that would have to be in a greenhouse. You want to grow your own avocados, greenhouse. I think regardless where you live, like unless you live in like Florida or California or something, greenhouse, right? And then so garden, that's an option. Garden with greenhouse, right? And hunting, fishing. One thing about fishing is that you could, if you have the space, you could actually create your own pond with fish in it. You could supply your own fish in it. That's definitely one idea, to make your own pond and farm your own fish from your own pond. Okay, so just things to think about. Foraging. Boy, you can't read that at all, can you? That says foraging. Foraging for wild edibles, whatever's in your area. I guarantee every single area, okay, I don't guarantee every single area. Most areas, right? Most areas have wild edibles available, especially here in the US. I cannot speak for outside of the US, okay? I know Canada has a lot of wild edibles, that kind of stuff, but honestly, I can't speak outside that. So foraging is definitely an option. And then outside of that, local. So like local farms, your local farms and local community, you can't see that, can you? Community, it says community. And your local community are going to be huge assets when it comes to getting supplies that maybe you can't get on your own, or they're just going to be cheaper, right? So like I found a local grain company, super cheap grains, like the cheapest I've ever seen in my entire life. And it was, food, human grade or whatever. And I was like, yes, I'm going to get on that. Anyway, my point is I'll have another video that talks all about where to buy some bulk items. Anyway, so local farms, that says farms. That's an F. Okay, so local farms, boy, I write really fast. So local farms in your community to find and source things that you maybe are able to produce yourself, or, like if you don't have a cow, you're gonna have to find local milk. You don't have to, right? But you may want to find local milk, things like that. So things that you may not be able to produce yourself, you really want to look to those local farms in the local community. And then lastly, how to preserve all of this, right? If we're talking about, continuing the cycle of producing food, right? Because our stored food is only going to last so long, period, okay? Even if you store a year's worth of food, are you only going to live for a year, right? So if you have a year's worth of food, what you want to start doing almost immediately, not even, in the apocalypse, I want you to start doing this now. Start growing in that garden. Start learning to hunt and fish. Start learning to forage. Start looking for your local farms. And then start learning to preserve. Because with all of these things, keep hitting this thing, with all of these things, you are going to have to learn to preserve this stuff. You're going to have to learn to preserve the stuff that you foraged. You're going to have to learn to preserve the stuff that you've hunted and fished. You're going to have to learn to preserve the stuff from your garden. You're going to have to learn to preserve the stuff from your local farm. If you get milk, could you make cheese and yogurt from it? What can you do with this stuff that you source, or that you hunt, or that you forage, or that you garden? Can you garden year round? Could you garden year round in your greenhouse? Could you do microgreens and sprouts? You must consider all these options now. And I know this seems overwhelming, but we really have to take seriously the fact that the food that we store every day, the canned foods and things, like I said, even if you're storing for a year, that's only a year. And even if you do store a year for your entire household, that's a lot of stuff to store. So you're going to have to start looking into, how am I going to continue to feed my family once my stored foods start to deplete? You know what I mean? And don't think about that, 3 months into your food storage. You need to be starting to think about this now, because gardens, they take a long time. Hunting and fishing, never guaranteed. Foraging, extremely seasonal in many places. Local farms, again, they may not be producing stuff year round. Maybe they only do hay. Maybe they have milk year round. That's great. But your local farms and community may actually be a huge asset to you year round. And then preserving can be done almost any time. But what type of preserving are you doing? Your layers work together. It's not that I'll never touch the long-term layer. It's that we do pull from our long-term layer, but it's less often. I like to have my everyday and short-term stocked, so that I don't have to pull from that long-term layer. The long-term layer is just kind of there so that, it's there to last a long time, But if I ever have to pull for the long-term layer to fill a short-term layer or an everyday layer need, I will. None of our food is off limits, but we do have to realize that you can only store so much. And that's kind of the whole point of this whole thing. I know this is a lot to think about, but I actually have a little PDF down below that goes through all of this that I just talked about, that talks about the layers in depth and how you can continue your food supply and your prepping supplies long after your food storage is gone. But don't think about it when it's gone. Think about it right now, before you even have to fully rely on it. Okay, I know this is one of my longer videos, but I really hope it was helpful. Thank you all so much for watching Conquer Tomorrow by Preparing Today, and do not forget to download that PDF. Thank you all so much for watching. Bye-bye.